Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
Our surprise this time is the Nameless Food. Now, all food has some kind of name, so we'll have to work out why it's the Nameless Food. But just give us the point in the story, Mike. Where are we? What's going on?
Well, what have we seen in previous episodes, David? We've seen God's people who had ended up in slavery in Egypt, who through God's miraculous intervention have been delivered from that slavery under the leadership of Moses. After the 10 plagues, they escaped across the Red Sea through that miraculous parting. God has led them since that point on their journey by what we call the ancient sat-nav, that pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And they are now heading south down towards Sinai. We noted in a previous episode how God didn't lead them the quickest route, which would have only taken 10 days up that coast road because of the strong Philistine cities that were there. And so God has led them south instead into the desert. And of course, the minute you start traveling into the desert, there are challenges that are going to face you, aren't there?
Just remind us how many people are travelling in the desert together.
Yeah, remember, we've got sort of 2 to 2.5 million people. It's one of these mass people movements that you sometimes see on television footage. Not unusual in the ancient world to have mass people movements like this. So we've got in the desert these sort of 2 to 2.5 million people. Wow, imagine that line and imagine the breadth of it as they're going through. So that's an awful lot of people for Moses to be responsible for. And as they are traveling through the desert, obviously, desert life will have its own challenges. Not least, what are you going to eat? What are you going to drink? And after what I think must have been the euphoria of escaping and the euphoria of crossing the Red Sea, and we see a little bit of that at the beginning of Exodus 15, when we get the song of Moses and Miriam. They come up with this song that they sing praise to God, and it probably reflects the joy and excitement of what God had done. But then as they journey south into the desert, we read that they traveled for 3 days without finding water. So suddenly, the reality of life in the desert for such a large group of people is starting to come home.
They'd left their life of slavery, as I recall, by being given all sorts of resources. So they had a lot of things with them, but food and water, the basics, they couldn't take.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the strange things, wasn't it? God had caused the Egyptians to favor them and bless them with gifts along their way. It's probably quite a superstitious thing on the part of the Egyptians, almost like, good luck, chum, take this, here's my token as you go. But of course, the thing you can't take much of is the very thing that you absolutely need, the most fundamentals of life, food and water. It's funny, isn't it? Still today, you can have loads of stuff. You can have a big bank account. You can have 10 cars parked on the drive. But if you do not have food and water, you are in trouble. And it was that sudden lack of food and water that caused the Israelites to do what they will do again and again during this wilderness journey, because we read in verse 24 of chapter 15, the people grumbled against Moses. Won't be the last time that we'll read that kind of word.
And I guess the first, most important resource they need is water. They need something to drink if they're in a desert environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the first thing that God provides for them at the end of chapter 15. Interesting, he does it in 2 quite different ways. The first way is really utterly miraculous. They end up arriving at a water source in the desert, but when they get there, they discover that the water is foul. It's not potable. It's not drinkable. And so what God tells Moses to do in response to him calling out to God is to throw a piece of wood into the water. And we read that he threw it into the water and the water became sweet. Now, various people have suggested various explanations of how that could happen. Maybe it was a certain type of water, some sort of herbal remedy that purified the water. But I think in this particular case, it simply was a miracle. Why do I think that? Because God makes a life lesson for the Israelites out of this. It's something that he wanted them to remember. So having done that miracle, we read this, that there the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them and said, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases that I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Wow, that's a really powerful verse there, isn't it? Now, sometimes that verse has been taken out of context. I am the Lord who heals you can become a bit of a catchword, that here is a promise that God will always heal us from whatever comes. Actually, in context, the text says that if the Israelites obey God, then this particular miracle is a reminder to them that God will never bring on them any of the diseases, any of the plagues that he brought on the Egyptians. So it's actually very specific rather than a promise that God's people will never get sick. Actually, there are plenty of examples in both the Old Testament and the New Testament where God's people get sick. And sometimes they are prayed for and healed, and sometimes they are prayed for and not healed. There's one little reference in one of Paul's letters where he says, I left Trophimus in Miletus sick. I'm sure knowing Paul, he would have prayed for him, but this guy didn't get well. So this is not a sort of carte blanche coverall, a promise that God's people will never get sick. It's a life lesson for Israel out of that particular miracle that the plagues that came on Egypt will never come on them if they walk in his ways. And that miracle was a reminder to them of how he would provide for them. I said there were two ways that he provides water. The first was miraculous. Actually, the second way then wasn't miraculous at all, because we then read on at the end of chapter 15 that they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. So in other words, God then led them to what we would call an oasis. So the first provision is miraculous, completely miraculous. The second provision is, in inverted commas, more natural, more normal. But here are both clearly the provision of God, whether by the supernatural or the natural. It was God who guided them by that sat-nav, that ancient sat-nav we spoke about previously, to this particular place. So here's the incredible provision of God, both miraculously and naturally, for his people in the desert.
Is it important perhaps to remember that, as you said earlier, this all happened as a result of them moaning and grumbling and complaining? In other words, did they have a short memory about what had happened?
Oh my goodness. They didn't half have a short memory. One of the things that you see as you read through the book of Exodus and Numbers, which is the other book that records their journey from Mount Sinai, that they'll reach soon, to the Promised Land, is that we will see repeated examples of them moaning and repeated examples of them saying, we would have been better off back in Egypt. Now, remember the first one of those we saw in a previous episode, the minute they hit the Red Sea and they were trapped by the water in front and the Egyptians behind, and they even there start to say, oh, we'd have been better off in Egypt. Why did we ever leave? It was all your fault, Moses, for bringing us out here. Didn't we tell you to leave us alone? So we're going to see this again and again. And to anyone who's reading through Exodus and Numbers, look out for those repeated examples of God's people moaning the same old thing in the same old way and not learning out of it.
So because they were moaning and groaning, might that have prompted God to perform that miracle with the wood and lead them to water in the way that he did?
Yes, I think he's trying to show them, look, this is me at work. I've led you out of here. If God leads us, God will provide us. That's still true today. If God has led us into something, then God will provide in it. And it may not be instant. It may not be immediate. It may not be the way that we expected. It may end up being miraculous or what looks much more natural, but God will do it. If God has spoken and God is leading us, then God will provide for us. And that comes out again and again.
So they've been given water by God, sweet water. They must be so much happier.
Yes, for about 2 minutes. Well, maybe for a couple of days' journey or so, because as we move straight from chapter 15 to chapter 16, obviously they spend a little time at the oasis in Elim, probably fill up all their water skins and so on to get ready for the next stage of the journey. But then we read in chapter 16, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Mount Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month that they'd come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled. Oh, there we are again. We didn't get very far, did we? They grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And they said to him, here we go, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death.
Did they sit around and eat pots of meat?
Exactly. That's the very last thing they had done. What had they left in Egypt? They had left a life of slavery. Anyone knows life as a slave would not have been easy in those days. Food supplies would have been minimal, basic, but they rewrite history. There's a lovely passage in Numbers where they talk about, we remember when we were back in Egypt and we ate all those melons and those cucumbers and and all that caviar and drank all that champagne. They are rewriting history. But you know what? We can still be the same today. We can rewrite history of how things used to be, how we think things used to be when we are facing challenges. And churches are not exempt from that. How many times have I heard as a pastor people saying, in such and such year, we used to do that. This was wonderful. And I think, yeah, it was, but it had its challenges as well. It wasn't all wonderful. And the human mind has a huge capacity to rewrite history when it finds itself cornered. And actually, what this comes out of is they were frightened. They were there in a desert place that they'd not been to before, were worried that, they got water now, but worried that they were running out of food. And out of that fear, really, in that situation, they begin to grumble against Moses and Aaron as their leaders. But of course, in grumbling against them, they're grumbling against God who is leading them.
So the lesson they should be learning is that God will provide.
Absolutely. And in fact, chapter 16 will go on to show us what is a huge surprise in this story. Now, already we've seen the surprise of that water miraculously being turned from foul water to drinking water. But then the next big surprise in this story will come, well, again, in two ways. It's now a month after they've left Egypt. So, the euphoria has passed. The reality is definitely sinking in now. They've been rewriting history, as we've seen. So God now makes a promise to them. In verse 4 of chapter 16 of Exodus, we read that the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. Now, bread in those days was simply the general word for food.
Because they've been without food for a month.
They certainly were running to the end of their supplies. Whatever they'd had, they've definitely run out of now, haven't they? So God promises to give them bread from heaven, food from heaven, and tells them that they are to go out and to collect this. And so we find that being provided for by God in two quite different ways. Interestingly enough, one more natural, one more supernatural, though God clearly at work in both. The first provision we find in chapter 16 is that he sends a huge flock of quail.
Little birds.
Those little birds, yeah. Now, we know that birds migrate over this region around this time of year. So we're around about April time. And we do know that there's massive migrations of birds over that area. So at one level, this is natural. But what God causes these birds to do is not just to fly over that area, but to land at their feet and to sit there for them to be able to take, presumably throw a stone at or whatever, get a stick, kill them. And there's a provision. So at one level, that's perhaps we might say fairly natural. Birds do fly over that part of the world that time of year. Though the last time anyone ever saw a bird come and sit at someone's feet and lie on its back and say, "Here I am, take me," I'd like to know. The second provision is where our nameless food surprise comes in. Because this really is, I think we'd have to say, an absolutely supernatural kind of food. So let's just read a few verses, shall we, from verse 13 onwards. We'll pick up the previous story. That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Each one of you is to take as much as he needs." And we'll perhaps come back to how much they took and what they did with it in a moment. Now, it's interesting. The Hebrew for that question, "What is it?" is the word manna.
Manna from heaven.
And that's exactly what this becomes known as. Go and get some manna. Go and get some, what is it? Because they had never seen anything like it. Go and get some, what's its name?
Yeah, because it doesn't have a name.
It doesn't have a name. So they call it manna. What's its name? And we've now taken that title and used it as what it was. So this is clearly supernatural. How do we know? First of all, because of what they call it. Manna. What is it? They have never seen anything like this before, this sort of flaky like substance. Chapter 16, verse 31 tells us that it was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Numbers 11 tells us that they would either grind it or cook it in a pot and make it into cakes. And it tells us there it tasted like something that was made with olive oil. But it's clearly supernatural. One, because they have no idea what it is. And second, because Moses defines it in verse 15 as the bread the Lord has given you to eat. So here again, we've got two kinds of surprises. One, perhaps a little more natural. Yeah, birds do fly over that part of the world, though it's really surprising they come and sit at your feet. One, utterly supernatural, just like with the water, the manna, the what is it? A clearly supernatural provision of food from God.
I can't imagine how it would be used on the Great British Bake Off, but it sounds as if it's got quite a nice taste. But bear in mind, that's all they're given, the quail and the manna. That's not a very varied diet.
Yes, and, eventually they will start to grumble about this as well. Again. And, I'm sure you're right. The Great British Bake Off would come up with some fantastic recipes, I'm sure. But eventually they start grumbling about this provision. Interesting, isn't it? Again, how easy it is to forget what God has done for us. How easy it is to become ungrateful for what God has given us. I mean, even today, things that we should be so grateful to God for, things like the home we live in, the job we have, the money it brings in. Now, maybe it's not quite as much money as we like, but hey, there's provision for us, the family, the friends that we have, the church that we are part of. With all its ups and downs, it is so easy to end up, well, frankly, becoming ungrateful for and even despising of what God has given. And these people will eventually just get really fed up of this endless provision. Now, they seem to be forgetting that, the alternative is, would you like to eat this, or would you prefer to starve to death? But no, their minds are very, very short. And so we'll constantly get what we've referred to already, their desire to, we'd have been better off back in Egypt, forgetting how things really were.
To what extent do they start laying down their own conditions to God?
Some of them do it in the way that they handle this, because God tells them through Moses that what they are to do is they are only to collect each day what is sufficient for that day. And only on the day before the Sabbath could they collect twice as much, so that on Sabbath they didn't have to go out and do the laboring and the work of collecting it, because Sabbath was a day of rest. And most of the people followed that, but there was some, we discover in this chapter, who thought they knew better and who wanted to take more than what they needed. And guess what happened? The extra just rotted. It went moldy. And I think there's quite a challenge to us out of that story today of how much is enough.
We always want more.
We always want more, don't we? It's easy for us to think, if only I had a little bit better of a pay rise this year, if only I had that little bit more. Well, how much more would be enough? How much more would satisfy us? Or even in terms of saving, I don't think there's anything wrong with saving. It's prudent to save and have a little bit to fall back on for hard days if we're in a position to do that. It's prudent to put money into a pension so that we're not a burden on others when we get older, if we're in a position to do that. But it's very easy to keep accumulating all this stuff and money to ourselves and taking more than we need, and perhaps forgetting that God has given us these resources to be generous with. Paul talks at length in 2 Corinthians, a couple of chapters there, how he talks at length about, look, God's given generously to you. Give generously to others. Use your resources for others. But these people were in getting mode, keeping mode, gathering mode, getting it for me. And yet the lesson was it didn't work, because when they tried to do that, they simply found that the extra that they took, when they took more than they needed, it rotted and became moldy. What a challenge to us there about, are we taking more than we really need? Because it will only, as it were, metaphorically rot when we could be doing something much more useful with it.
How long did this provision from God go on for?
Now this is amazing. So it went on for 6 days a week, because there was none on the 7th, week after week, after week, after week, after month, after month, after year, for 40 years.
Wow.
But it only went on for the 40 years of their wilderness journey. So at the end of chapter 16, we read these verses, as the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna in front of the testimony, that's the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle, that it might be kept. So they kept some to be a reminder, a permanent reminder of what God had done. And the Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. And when we get to the book of Joshua, we will find that one of the first things that happens as they cross the River Jordan and come into their land of inheritance in the land of Canaan, it specifically says that day the manna stopped falling. It's as if God is saying, okay, you're home now. Here's your land. You're now going to have to work. You're going to have to dig the soil. You're going to have to sow seed. You're going to have to harvest crops. I've brought you into a place of provision. And perhaps a message there to us about, God does have different seasons of providing for us in different ways. And if our lives are in his hands, then we should be ready to receive those different seasons from him and to receive his provision in different ways, and not always to expect it's going to be coming to us this way. It may come that way instead, but he has committed himself to provide for his people. But the way in which he does it may vary in the different seasons of our life, and we really do need to be open to that.
Because presumably after 40 years, there's the danger that they could have just taken it for granted.
Yeah, and I think, isn't it so easy to do that, David, with anything in our relationship with God, to take it for granted because, well, it's been around all that long, privilege of being able to pray and talk to the creator of the universe. Well, I didn't really have time to chat to him today. The privilege of being able to go and join with God's people to worship together freely. Well, it was a nice sunny day today and we thought the beach looked a bit more inviting instead. It is so easy to take God's provision for granted. And yet this whole story that we get in the book of Exodus and Numbers is a challenge not to take it for granted, but to learn how to be very grateful with his provision, whether it's miraculously provided water or naturally provided water, more naturally provided quail or supernaturally provided manna, whether it's in the 40 years of the wilderness of miraculous provision or through the working by their hands provision in the land of Canaan. We need to be really careful not to take for granted what God so graciously provides for us.
If after 40 years they'd been able to turn the clock back and give advice to themselves about what they should have done at the beginning, what do you think that might have been?
Oh, my goodness. If all of us could do that, wouldn't that be great? I think they would have said, do you know what? Do trust God. Be careful not to get into grumbling with God. God does provide. Don't get ungrateful for what he does or how he does it. Do trust him, because all of these provisions are about understanding really who God is. And there's a repeated refrain of that in chapter 16 about all these things happening so that they would know this is God at work. And I think they would have probably told one another, don't get ungrateful.
In conclusion, what would you say are the dangers of any of us, even now, grumbling against God, becoming even bitter?
It's very, very easy to slip into. I don't think any of us would ever wake up and say, do you know what? I am going to have a real moaning against God day today. I think we slip into it when we forget what God has done, when we become ungrateful for even the routine provision of our life, when we just take that for granted, the fact that we get paid at the end of each week or each month, and it just goes into our bank account and it almost becomes a right. It's very easy to become ungrateful. It's very easy to become forgetful of what God has done. It's very easy to see these as natural things rather than things that God is involved with. Because, as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, there are at least a couple of verses in chapter 16 of Exodus where it's made very clear that these miracles were to remind them that this was God at work. So he says, I'm going to make this provision of the quail, for example. And it says at the end of verse 12, then you will know that I am the Lord, your God. I wonder how many of us think about the food on our table or the salary or the pension that comes in or the friends that we have or the church that we have or the opportunities we're given. How often we see those in terms of, then you'll know that I am the Lord. I'm the one who's given you all this. Yes, you went out to work for it, but can you not see that I'm involved in that? So it's really important we learn how to be grateful, that we learn how not to be neglectful, to say thank you for the daily things that we have. Saying grace, giving thanks before our food is not something that an awful lot of Christians still do these days. But it's a great opportunity just to stop and remember. Very strong Jewish tradition to this day. Jesus did it himself. And it's a simple thing. And I think if we could write into our lives those simple things, and it may not be saying grace before a meal, it may be something else, but writing things into our rhythm of life to remind us not to be ungrateful, to be ready to receive in a thankful way the provision of God, whether it is supernatural or natural, and equally to retain an element of mystery, I suppose. The manna, what is it? Well, I know what it is. It's my salary. But at one level, oh, Lord, what is it that you should keep providing for me like that? So the Nameless Food Challenge still continues for us today. It can still be a surprise for us today, whether natural or supernatural. Let's just make sure we maintain a heart that is incredibly grateful for it and that never takes it for granted.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.